Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Lori London. I'm a marketing manager here at Hyperproof, and I'll be getting us started. Today, we'll be talking about elevating security and the power of the CIS critical security controls. Our experts will discuss the CIS critical security controls, a prescriptive, prioritized, and simplified set of best practices that can strengthen your cybersecurity posture. They'll explain the basic foundation of the CIS controls, help you understand how to assess applicability for your organization, explain how to adopt best practices around CIS controls, and share more details about the upcoming changes that will be made to the CIS controls. A bit of housekeeping points before we get started. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, we welcome you to enter them into the Q&A box for our presenters to answer in the final 15 minutes of the event. If you're having any problems with audio or visual during the event, please try leaving the presentation and re-entering. If this doesn't work, please let us know you're having trouble in the Q&A box. The event is being recorded and will be available on demand on our Bright Talk channel following the closing of the event. Attendees will also receive an email with a link to the on-demand event and the featured CIS ebook as well. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Kane McGladrey, Hyperproof's Field CISO, and Charity Otwell, Director, Critical Security Controls from CIS. Take it away.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lori. And I want to thank everyone for spending some of your time with us today. Our agenda is going to cover the CIS security controls and the business advantages, and we'll close out with some potential future changes to the CIS critical security controls. So as Lori said, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat, and we'll have some time at the end to respond to those at the end of the presentation. So the reason you're here today is because you're either considering adopting the CIS critical security controls, or as Charity will tell you,
or you're already using them and want to know how to leverage them more effectively. Many companies are just beginning to implement their cybersecurity program, had a change in leadership or a change in company mission, which can lead to a needed reevaluation of what is considered to be acceptable risk or what constitutes maturity posture. I can tell you, after spending about 90% of my professional career in the financial services industry, and if you know anything about banking, you know that there are typically multiple mergers and acquisitions. Mergers and acquisitions often can significantly disrupt cybersecurity views at the top of the house, right? So that makes it critically important to understand why is it important to have a roadmap to maturity. Maybe you're just starting out and want to build a program from ground up. Maybe you already have a solid program but want to improve your security posture and demonstrate that to leadership for strategic planning. If any of these scenarios describe your business, you are in the right place today. CIS controls are designed to provide guidance to any enterprise at all stages in their maturity journey, and for helping our end users evaluate, select, and implement the right set of safeguards.
Fantastic. And companies don't really choose control frameworks because they're a lot of fun.
I'm not sure I understand.
Oh, hello. Somebody's got their voice assistant on. That's kind of fun. That's the funnest part of this presentation. But instead, if people choosing control frameworks, they choose them to reduce risks, but they also choose them to improve their cybersecurity maturity, and they also will choose them to streamline security and their business processes. So I want us to start by exploring why you should choose the CIS critical security controls, some of the business advantages associated with using it, and then really we've got Charity on from the Center for Internet Security, so she can share with us a little bit of what the future holds for the program. But first, let's get a grounding here. I want Charity, who's from the Center for Internet Security, to give our audience a pretty broad overview of the Center for Internet Security's critical security controls to really lay the groundwork and foundation for today's discussion. That way, if you're still deciding which framework your organization should use, you can see if the CIS CSC is really a good fit for your organization. Charity?
Absolutely. Thanks, Kane. So for any of you that are already not familiar with the Center for Internet Security, or CIS, I want to give you a little background on the history of our company. Since I only began working here at CIS in April of this year, I'll be honest, I had to reach out to our chief evangelist to get some good background on the start of CIS, since it has a pretty cool history. In the late 90s and early 2000s, multiple government entities were working towards a standardized list of security measures. So NSA had a version, which many of our leadership staff and really original core team here at CIS is former NSA. The Defense Information Systems Agency, or DISA, had an early version. And if you know anything about DISA, those are what are now known as STIGs. And NIST was also working towards a corporate standard for security as well. So a lot of big players were working towards what seemed to be a common goal. Thus, the need to take all of these incredibly intelligent ideas and recommendations, as well as all of the volunteers that we had experienced, and utilize this as a centrally managed IT community for collaboration, which is really where this idea for CIS started to become evident. But it was also becoming apparent in that in order to take the best brains in the industry and create best practice content and then be able to give it away, this would need to sit within a nonprofit, right? Which is eventually what became CIS. So at that point, and for the next 10 years, the CIS content development was really just the secured configurations, or what we know today as benchmarks. So the second part of the story begins in 2001. So Tony Sager, who is our chief evangelist that I mentioned just a moment ago, was running the vulnerability testing for defense at NSA, and grabbed a group of around 5 people from the Red Team exercises with the directive of, we are not leaving this room until we all agree on the fundamental first steps for cybersecurity defense. So they literally wrote this out on paper and ended up drafting a letter to the Pentagon for, based on our experience with Red Team exercises and attacks, this is how best to get started on standing up a proper cyber defense. And it was intended for release to the public. So without making my story way too long, this letter made its way, the letter to the Pentagon made its way to Alan Powler, who is the founder and former president of the SANS Technology Institute. He picked it up and ran with it for several years and really made it his pet project for a while. And it ended up being better suited, again, within a nonprofit to maintain that mission of public service and serving the cyber underserved. So that list of security measures that I'm talking about is what became what we know today as the CIS controls. So at this point, CIS has been around for nearly 25 years, which is a lot for a nonprofit, with significant growth and a huge international reach, and quite an impressive inventory of best practice guidance and services over the 25 years. CIS is a US-based company and continues to harness the power of a global IT community. And that's certainly something that I hope that you pick up on the presentation today, is that we listen to those communities, and they're made up of a lot of folks. In the cybersecurity best practice market, there are multiple big players here, right? We pride ourselves on being leaders in the space, but also extremely collaborative. We have a great relationship with NIST, for example, and try to remain in lockstep with their recommendations, with CIS focusing more on serving the cyber underserved and providing as many best practice resources as possible to our end users as possible that can be free. The CIS mission also includes to identify, develop, validate, promote, and sustain best practice solutions for cyber defense. And we really aim to create consensus-based best practices by listening to those communities and consistently analyzing industry threats and trends to stay current and proactive in our quest. So next I want to talk to you about the CIS controls themselves, and that's what you're looking at on the screen here. So what are the CIS critical security controls, and why are they important? So there are so many frameworks out there, right? Why choose this one? This is a question we've been asked many times, and rightfully so. Firstly, they are a prioritized set of safeguards that defend against the most prevalent cyber attacks, which is a very powerful statement, and I will get into that a little bit more later. You're viewing the latest version, which is 8.0. This was released in May of 2021. Many of you likely knew this set previously as the CIS Top 20, which is a previous version. Part of our guiding principles over the years has been to make things as simple and digestible to the end user as possible, And so since we have, end users spanning from level 1 analysts all the way to your C-suite, we've consolidated the 20 into 18 controls that we feel are essential for cyber hygiene. So why did we change the controls in the first place? Why a new version? As mentioned before, we are constantly evaluating the industry and have updated the 18 controls to include new technologies such as cloud and mobile. We also combined redundant controls and safeguards to make it more concise for the adopters. The 18 are organized by activity versus how things are managed. Example here being audit logging, which was seen in various places in previous versions and made better sense to combine it and remove some of the controls around that to make it more concise and easily digestible. We understand that we have to serve our readers that are in all skill sets with many different industries, and made an effort to provide more consistent language on the new version. There was also an addition of one control, specifically control number 15, which is service provider management, which addresses how organizations should manage cloud devices. So I told you there was 2 reasons. So secondly, the CIS controls are globally recognized. In fact, over half of our downloads are outside of the US. So you have the assurance you are adopting a fully vetted, far-reaching best practice standard. Additionally, the controls are mapped to major regulatory frameworks and are able to demonstrate regulatory compliance, which we'll get into a little bit more later. It's also important to notate that they are researched, designed, written, and maintained by our controls cybersecurity engineers. And I personally know this and how intelligent and fabulous they are because they work for the controls team. So awesome. So all of this talk of the safeguards, right? So what are the safeguards? Each of these controls that you saw on the previous slide are broken down into individual, unique actions or sub-controls that we call safeguards. Each of them are prescriptive, measurable, and require only one action per safeguard. So if you've ever implemented some of the other framework recommendations, you've probably seen that it can be, multiple recommendations rolled into one, albeit they're good recommendations, but it can be a bit overwhelming and sometimes open for interpretation. So this is where CIS guiding principles come in again. We absolutely do not disagree with any of our good buddies at, for instance, NIST, but the safeguards are designed at CIS to be easy to understand and easy to implement. As I mentioned on the previous slide, we've done all the prioritization work for you, which helps to answer the question, where in the world do I begin? So we've established that there are 153 total safeguards, which is a lot, right? So how do I implement that is a question answered on the next slide with implementation groups. Goodness gracious. All right, implementation groups. So the IGs are based upon risk profile and resources an organization has available to them to implement. So as you move through the IGs, they are aimed at increased need for complex protections and more sophisticated attackers. So really remember here, as you're looking through the IG 1, 2, and 3, that they are intended to build upon each other. And really that's going to be your maturity roadmap. So IG1 is essential cyber hygiene. You'll hear me say that a lot today. So that's your essential cyber hygiene group, and where we tell all organizations to begin their roadmap to maturity. So this represents an emerging minimum standard of information security for all organizations. There are 56 total safeguards in this group, and what we would consider foundational. Like I've said previously, we've done all the prioritization work for you, and this is absolutely step 1. IG2 builds on IG1, as mentioned before, and introduces an additional 18 safeguards with a total of 74 safeguards in this group. So this group prescribes what has to be done for more sensitive components of an organization, depending upon the resources and information that they have to handle. So this is also the second phase in achieving your cybersecurity maturity roadmap. Lastly, IG3 is the highest level of cyber hygiene and incorporates all 153 safeguards. So these are your steps taken for fully mature organizations to protect the most sensitive parts of their missions. So all of this talk of safeguards and implementation groups, I'd like to take you through an actual success story. So we did a case study around building up cyber defenses in compliance with state laws, and this is available on our website as well. I'll give you the high level story. So I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, at one point in your careers have said, information security is everyone in the company's job, not just information security staff. And then you face the challenge of actually training said company-wide staff on the importance of password policy, multi-factor authentication, insert here, right? Well, what if you were trying to enforce that with an elementary school age child? School districts face the unique challenge of protecting their students' data privacy from cyber threats as well, right? So this is an interesting challenge that we've seen in our communities. One particular case study highlights a school district in New Hampshire, and their compliance challenge was they had to follow NIST Special Publication 800-171, which does not implicitly provide a prescribed format on how to proceed with that. So fortunately, the CIS controls do map to NIST, so that's where the journey began. Their path from baseline cyber defense to a more matured posture began in 2018. So they started with IG1 as recommended, and were able to show that the implementation of what steps to implement and utilizing it as a checklist. So it took the guesswork out of what steps to implement, is one of the quotes from their leadership. So this was implemented with a fairly small team of 300 staff, with end users being the students, and there were 1,300 of those. So upon successful completion of this, they were able to further their maturity roadmap and move on to increased implementation groups, right? Which actually landed this particular leader in being awarded the SANS Difference Maker Award for this implementation across the entire school's network. So this solidifies not only the mapping to major industry frameworks by CIS controls, but the prescriptive design of the safeguards and the maturity roadmap provided by the implementation groups themselves. So as I'm hoping you are starting to realize, the CIS controls are designed to provide essential cyber hygiene to any industry. This particular case study was around state privacy laws and privacy, and which CIS controls are mapped to. So some of the further benefits of the CIS controls, right? The prescriptive guidance, and that it's an ecosystem. So now that we've been through what the controls are, let's talk about the benefits of using them. There are other CIS resources that are provided to adopters for additional support. All of the content that I'm about to tell you about is free to download on the CIS website. That is the beauty of working for a nonprofit dedicated to serving the cybersecurity community. First and foremost, about the ecosystem, it's not about the list. And what I mean by that is, it's not just about a list of the 18 controls and the 153 safeguards, right? CIS has an entire ecosystem of guidance for all of our controls adopters. Over the years, as the versions have evolved with the threat landscape our practitioners are actually faced with, so has the supporting documentation. So we currently have over 100 documents that are constantly maintained. These documents have been downloaded over 33,000 times just in 2023 alone, and we continue to see those numbers increase over time. So what does the ecosystem contain specifically? So the content falls into several different categories. Again, all of this is available for download on the website. So just some of the highlights from the ecosystem itself. I'm certainly not going to go through 100 documents today. We have white papers, such as the cost of cyber defense, which is a white paper designed to provide insight around what considerations go into cyber defense budget as it pertains to the available tools and implementation of said tools, which can be quite overwhelming. We also have industry-specific guides we call companion guides, such as Internet of Things, mobile, cloud companion guides for mapping, or how to implement implementation group 1 for small to medium enterprises. So we also have in-house tools that we've built over the years that are specific around self-assessment. We will go into self-assessment a little bit more later when we talk about maturity of the cybersecurity program itself. But self-assessment is of course extremely important. We have a controlled self-assessment tool, which is the cybersecurity assessment tool that we offer to our adopters. We also have a business impact analysis tool, which is scoped specifically for ransomware. If you're familiar with business impact analyses concept at all, it's really your availability risk assessment around specific business processes, which in this instant that I'm speaking of is ransomware specific. We also have a suite of policy templates. Over the years, the community outreach has been the CIS controls look great, but each of the controls start with having a policy. How do you write a policy? So this led to us building out some of those templates. It's not fully comprehensive, but we've taken some of the more complex practices such as configuration management and created a policy template for users to download and use as a guide. So they've been so successful, we're actually considering writing more based upon the community need. I know that HyperProof does a great job of demonstrating crosswalks, or what we would call mappings, which is also part of the controls ecosystem, in which we maintain an impressive inventory of major framework mappings that you would expect, right? Your NIST, your ISO, COBIT, to emerging and newly released framework mappings that we actually receive directly from our community by request. So another less tangible but also critical piece of the ecosystem is our external relationships. We have trusted partnerships to help collaborate with us on what our fellow cybersecurity professionals are actually seeing in the field, right? So a great example of this is the relationship between CIS and Verizon. Each year, Verizon spends an extensive amount of time and research to provide end users with the data breach investigations report. And as a result, I can happily report that they endorse the use of IG1 safeguards to defend against the top 5 attacks. For reference, those top 5 attacks are malware, ransomware, web application hacking, insider privilege and misuse, and targeted intrusions. So I recommend you check out the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report if that interests you at all, as well as we have lots of blogs and webinars that go a lot more in depth around their individual findings, expected trends for the next year, and a deep history of what we have with Verizon.
Thanks, Charity. And I love the mention there of the Verizon DBIR. It's the only annual report other than our own that I really look forward to seeing every year. So our second benefit is really in adopting and implementing the CIS controls is going to result in an improved security posture for your organization. And Charity touched on it briefly. I used to do executive advisory consulting, and the way I tell clients is IG1, Implementation Groups 1 safeguards, really should be thought of as a table stakes for any organization that has computers. Now, my personal opinion here is that most enterprises today should be at IG2, tailored to the threats and the risks that are facing their specific business. And IG3, again, this is my opinion, I'm not from the Center for Internet Security, so this is just my opinion. I think it's good for really highly targeted organizations that regularly deal with nation-state actors and advanced cybercrime groups. Think like your banks and your fintech, your other highly regulated entities, really. Charity, what are some of the other benefits associated with the CIS CSC?
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the other benefits for cybersecurity is, so we've gotten through, I'm sorry, I lost my place. There are several different resources that we have as part of the Security Best Practices Division of CIS. Controls is just one of those pieces. But what we thought was important to mention was 2 other key areas that are really that really complement each other and provide an even more holistic look at cybersecurity maturity. One of those, the first of those, is the CIS benchmarks, right? So our secure configuration guidelines for over 100 different technologies. So that can be servers, software, operating systems, cloud services, network devices, etc., which are technology specific and vendor agnostic, right? So they're also referred to as hardening standards for best practice and mapped to the CIS controls. So these are also referenced by certain industry frameworks such as PCI and FedRAMP. Benchmarks are also community developed based on the input of more than 12,000 IT security professionals who participate in the consensus process to develop secure configuration recommendations. I've only partially observed this process, and it is extremely tedious, I can tell you. But currently, there are more than 100 CIS benchmarks over across 25 plus vendor product families. They're available for free PDF download.
Fantastic. And I want to go back to something Charity was talking about framework mappings. Because if you're leveraging the CIS critical security controls and the right GRC tool, you can really help jumpstart your other critical risk reduction and compliance programs to your organization. Hyperproof has built-in crosswalks for, sorry, these slides disappeared there. This is exciting.
And I skipped a slide, so.
Please bear with us. Thank you. Technical things. There we go. Wonderful. So we've got crosswalks between frameworks, and that would, if you're using the Center for Internet Security's critical security controls, you can get most of the way to something like an ISO 27001 certification, or a SOC 2 Type 2, or maybe you need to follow the NIST's CSF, or PCI DSS, or maybe CMMC, or any of the other alphabet soup, really. You can get most of the way there, or all of the way there, with CIS critical security controls. And that's really important if your organization needs to maintain or obtain an external attestation, like a SOC 2, maybe to make your business-to-business sales a little easier, or an external certification, like ISO 27001, so that you can demonstrate compliance. You can really leverage the controls you already have defined and tailored for your organization rather than starting from scratch. For example, one of our customers, AppLovin, they wanted to organize their controls to create a single source of truth. And they wanted to do that to provide their leadership team as well as their board with complete visibility and transparency into their risk health and the mitigation work. So they set up their compliance programs in Hyperproof in a matter of weeks, and then they were able to use our crosswalks to see how the controls are related to each other. And also, they associated their controls with their risks so that they could show their stakeholders how those controls were reducing risks on a quarterly basis. And now they're using dozens of our integrations to really help accelerate evidence collection on a regular basis, so that way they have the confidence that controls are operating as expected. And they're also using an integration with Asana to automate the process of requesting evidence that can't be collected automatically. Something like maybe getting a sign off on a policy document. And that's really that automation is saving their team some valuable time. Charity, can you tell the audience a little bit more about other CIS resources like you mentioned before, like the benchmarks?
Yes, absolutely. And apologies, I skipped ahead to this. Benchmarks is just one of our secure configuration tools that we have. Secondly, to benchmarks, since I already spoke to that one, another resource there is the CIS hardened images, which is our pre-configured hardened VMs secured according to the CIS benchmarks for not only Azure but also AWS, GCP, and Oracle. Hardened Images provides users with secure, on-demand, and scalable computing environment in the cloud. Additionally, there is another configuration assessment tool CIS maintains to provide self-assessment against the hardening recommendations and implementation, also available to users. So essentially, the Hardened Images product is the operational support of benchmarks. So I hope that you are seeing the big picture, and all of these resources are related and really speak to the comprehensive best practice experience we're trying to achieve with the many different resources offered.
Thanks, Charity. And I just want to take a question from the chat. This is being recorded and it will be sent out to attendees after the event ends. So thanks for asking. And if you do have other questions, please do drop those in the chat. We will be taking them in the last 15 minutes of the presentation. But next, we're going to dive deeper into the business advantages of using the CIS critical security controls. Now, this is about sales friction, and I'd posit that if your organization does business with the federal government, you're going to end up using NIST because that's going to reduce sales friction with them and with that whole ecosystem. Now, that's not to say that NIST is right or somehow better, but if you're selling to or regularly dealing with the federal government in the United States, you're going to quickly find out everything in the world relates back to NIST. And it's typically the NIST CSF, unless you're working in the defense industrial base, which is my background, where you see a lot of NIST 800 171. Otherwise, if you're doing business in North America, I'd really recommend that you choose and tailor the CIS and then really leverage that to get most of the way to something like your SOC 2 Type 2. Now, if you're based in the European Union, you could, instead of mapping that to your SOC 2 Type 2, you could actually map the CIS to ISO standards because you'll find those to be in more common and regular use. Again, that's not because ISO is somehow better. They just tend to be more dominant overseas. And one of the real advantages of using the critical security controls is that it really allows your company's go-to-market team to communicate a proactive risk management stance. For example, if you align your policy documents to the Center for Internet Security's critical security controls, and you include references to the specific safeguards, then when an external purchaser or an auditor requests your policy documents and they open up and they look at them and they see, well, you're following an internationally recognized framework. You're not just making this stuff up as you go along, right? That goes a lot of a way to building trust with a new partner or building trust with your auditor. So there's a second business advantage. And that's if you've incorporated the CIS controls in your policy, but also in practice, so you're actually doing these things. Your company can actually get an affirmative tort defense in the case of a cyber breach in 4 states: Connecticut, Iowa, Ohio, and Utah. In practical terms, now that means that if your company has leaned into the CIS controls and you've got proof like policy documents and procedures, and you can use a tool like Hyperproof to show that you have evidence of regularly operating those controls, that if some bad thing happens, you have a cybersecurity incident and there's a civil lawsuit filed against your company in one of those states, the judge is more likely than not to say, no, actually, we're not moving ahead with this civil lawsuit. Now, I need to say this. I'm not an attorney, so this is not legal advice. And I'm still personally waiting for a test case to prove that this actually works in practice. But I've read the state laws, and they're pretty clear that if a company is following a published, reputable cybersecurity framework, like the Center for Internet Security's critical security controls, that they're going to have a much better outcome from the civil legal system than if they're not following a published cybersecurity framework. And when it comes to implementation of the CIS critical security controls, I'm about to sound like a consultant, right? I used to do this. I used to do consulting for a living. I'm going to recommend you do a gap analysis. Oh boy, here comes the consultant, right? But you need to do a gap analysis of your current controls versus what's in implementation group 1 or implementation group 2, depending on your company's maturity level, to understand really where you have gaps in your controls. And once you've completed that gap analysis, and you can use a tool like Hyperproof to complete that gap analysis by looking at the controls you currently have and where you don't have controls that match, I'd then encourage you to really formalize the process of documenting how each of your controls is aligned to the CIS CSC, and you can use Hyperproof to record those tailored controls in your environment. Well, next, I'd say before you move ahead, before you go, well, here are the other controls we need to deploy because the CIS says they're a good idea. No. Associate your existing controls with your risks. That way, your management team can understand the positive impact you're already having in reducing business risk to the company by using the CIS CSC. And that gives us then a view of which controls we have, which risks we're effectively reducing, but also which risks we might not be addressing because we haven't implemented those controls. And if you're talking to your CISO, a person like me, that's going to be what I want to know. I want to know, well, if we do these things, what's the business value here? Well, if it shows that you're actually reducing a risk materially, you're going to have a much better opportunity there to have a conversation and to move forward with the project than, well, the CIS just says it's a good idea, right? So we should just go do that blindly. And again, in Hyperproof, we can use all of the tools we have to track our progress in adopting the CIS CSC. But we can also, Hyperproof can help you automate the evidence collection for those controls that you've deployed and you're already operating. And I'm enthusiastic about automating evidence collection because it gives you a regular view into how effectively each of the controls is in reducing your risks. And the best way to do that is by setting up what we call an automated control test, which essentially allows you to evaluate if the evidence collected indicates that the control is working. So let's take an example. Let's say you have a control to maybe encrypt data at rest, and in CIS CSC, that's 3.11, encrypt sensitive data at rest. Well, if you're storing your data up on Amazon, you could check to see if the Amazon storage is encrypted. If the automated control test says, hey, it's still encrypted, easy day, right? You've got the confidence that your control is working and in reducing risks. And if you have a regulatory requirement, you're meeting that regulatory or perhaps that legal requirement. But let's say the control test pops back one day and says, well, somehow the data are now unencrypted. Maybe a developer created some new storage and they didn't encrypt it, right? You could then have Hyperproof automatically and proactively file a ticket using the ticketing system you're currently using. Maybe you're using Jira for that notification, right? To file a ticket for the team to remediate that control deficiency and also track that issue through to closure. And that way, you have a nearly real-time view of how effectively you're managing and also reducing your risks. But there's also another benefit to collecting and storing all of that evidence automatically. Let's say your company let's say you've got CIS, CSC up and running, and you need to adopt another framework or you need to meet another compliance regime. Maybe you need to meet HIPAA compliance or PCI DSS compliance. Well, you can reuse many of the controls you've already tailored to your organization, as well as your evidence of your control operation, as well as that automation to go collect that evidence of control operation. And you don't need to gin up some whole brand new process, right? Let's say you had CIS CSC and you wanted to get a SOC 2 Type 2 attestation from an external party. Using Hyperproof, you'd look at, well, what controls do we already have? What evidence do we already have? And then you can, instead of spending your time manually doing a crosswalk between CIS, CSC, and SOC 2 Type 2, instead of your time spent that, you can put your time getting towards the audit. For example, one of our customers, Strata Education, they were able to set up Hyperproof in 6 weeks, and they had a nearly 60% time savings in collecting their evidence so that they could expand their SOC 2 Type 2 for 2 additional parts of their business. And they aligned their controls against CIS CSC in order to improve their security maturity. And that included integrating automated evidence collection with the tools that they already used, like Google Cloud and Jump Cloud and ADP and GitHub and Salesforce. And that also means now, instead of having to take screenshots or get Excel files from different systems or book meetings that nobody ever wants to really go to with stakeholders to request evidence, right? They can actually now focus on the more important parts of security and compliance, like planning for future security investments based on CIS CSC. Charity, I've got to ask, could this also help companies with their cyber insurance applications or their reapplications?
Yes. So, and great information, Kane. That was great. So cybersecurity insurance, what a very hot topic, right? And rightfully so. So, 12 to 18 months ago, at CIS, we went down that route as well, right? We were trying to answer the question, will IG1 guarantee an organization's cybersecurity insurance or potentially impact premiums, renewals, et cetera, right? So it's certainly a buzzword in the market for a variety of reasons. We've seen it time and time again, right? The angst over, what is covered by insurance? Should there be a compromise? My background being in banking before I came here to CIS, I can remember multiple times walking through security incident response team exercises as part of a tabletop and coming to the question around, if X scenario happens, what, if anything, will your cybersecurity insurance policy cover? And I can also remember all of us looking around the room at each other, well, who's going to answer that? And at least once we had to actually pull the policy and fact check it ourselves, which even then it was a bit vague, if I'm being honest. And that was many years ago. I'm dating myself. And cybersecurity as well as cyber insurance has come a long way. So I'm mentioning this to provide some color around how our research went when we started this journey to answer said questions. So we looked into around 30 carriers. And I firstly realized this was a huge undertaking. As with any business model, each have their own, unique pricing models, various services, very extensive questionnaires, which we took the time to go through ourselves. And to be quite honest with you guys, some of the carriers that we reviewed didn't feel comfortable sharing that level of information that we're looking for. Right, we're wanting tactical mappings and resolute answers for that. So all of this to say two things. We understand that we need more research in this space around cybersecurity insurance. There were no indications that any of the safeguards that we already have within IG1 should be moved. So meaning IG1 still stands. That's really why we went into it. If there was something that needed to be adjusted in a .1 release or a new release of the controls, that we would be sensitive to that, and that we would have done our due diligence to get that evaluated. So, however, we do, if I'm being very honest, we do feel a little bit inconclusive about that, and so we're keeping it on the radar strategically for 2024. So hopefully, I'll have a lot more to report on that if we do this again. We've had multiple meetings also with several trusted advisors in that space and partners on this specific topic, and on the potential of maybe a cybersecurity insurance white paper that would go into that in detail, that would support the controls ecosystem that we talked about earlier. So.
Thanks, Charity. And now, as we get to this final section, I want to mention, if you've got questions for Charity or for me about cybersecurity, about controls, about the CIS CSC, please do drop those in the questions on I think it's the right-hand side of your screen. But in this final section, we're going to talk through some potential changes to the CIS critical security controls that are under consideration.
Yes, everyone always wants to know if there are changes coming about, because changes bring some churn. So cybersecurity insurance research is a great segue into the 8.1 go, no-go decisions. So earlier in the year and in part of last year, we went down the avenue of, should we release a mini release of the CIS control version 8.0, and discussed, I wanted to discuss with you guys why we selected that. So in an extensive amount of research, that constitutes a full release, or even a smaller release, right? So with our research of cybersecurity insurance not giving any indication of a need to reprioritize any of those safeguards already provided in IG1, that decision to release 8.1 was a no-go. Now, I've been asked to speak about that several times with different vendors, and a lot of them are happy that there's not a new version released. So this is typically seen as good news. But so along those lines, releasing new versions or even .1 versions cause a lot of churn, whether it's a tooling partner, Hyperproof, ServiceNow, Archer, any of our friends, or even an end user. Right, a version change can cause impact, especially to your smaller and medium-sized enterprises that have extremely limited staff to make those moves to a new release, especially when there's reprioritization of those safeguards. So we're highly sensitive to when and why that happens, and think about your other folks in the space of best practice recommendations and frameworks. It is usually many years in between those version releases. So lastly, for this part, full release of the controls version 9 is typically the question I get after breaking the news that 8.1 is a no-go this year. But I can tell you it will not be in 2024. So realistically, looking into 2025 or 2026 for controls version release 9.0. So if you are adopting version 8 already, or you have decided to, you are still in a good spot to do that. So two key things that I want to talk to you before we close out today and open it up for questions. One being, earlier this year, we released the Cost of Cyber Defense White Paper 1.0. And again, anything that I'm mentioning is available for free download. So we released this paper, and it took many months, over a year worth of research. And the paper specifically addresses three things when evaluating the cost of cyber defense as it pertains to tooling, right? Which protections to start with, which tools will be needed to implement those protections, and then how much will an implementation tool cost, right? That's a tall order to be addressed in a white paper. So the guide takes you through our review of the various costs associated with licensing for around 200 commercial vendors is what we looked for. And again, this is as it pertains to IG1. So the scope of this is for essential cyber hygiene. So keep in mind, if you're in larger implementation groups, it might change it a little bit, but methodology wouldn't change around that, right? So we utilized 10 categories, which helped better paint the picture and align the service types provided by the tools. Because if you've gone down that path, you know that it's all over the board. And then we further broke those categories into tiers. Now, tiers are for the sector, resources available to the company, and the like. So one of the reasons for that, as you all probably know, is that tools have their own pricing models and vary based upon device, user usage, and a variety of other things. So these categories really were created by our engineering team on the controls team to help the user understand big picture, right? And be able to select what best suited them. So this was extremely tedious analyses. For example, there are 56 safeguards in IG1, so there is certainly no need for 56 individual tools, of course, to provide these protections. So needless to say, it was a lengthy undertaking for our team to map that out and really make that data comparable and an ease of use to the adopter. So like I said, there's a variety within that paper on where you would fall into to help you with that budget. So all of that is fine and good, but we are already working on a 1.1 release of that exact guide. I was actually just updating the executive summary for that way too early this morning. But the scope of that release is to demonstrate our research as it pertains to cloud service and managed service provider costing data. So I can tell you this is extremely complex and not quite as comparable as your commercial tools that we reviewed, but we're able to provide in that release a published write-up of what we found in our cloud and managed services for those environments that are hybrid or outsourced, which we know is quite common. So this is set for early Q1 of 2024 for publication. So do be staying tuned to that. And then lastly, I wanted to talk to you about our community defense model. Earlier in the CIS controls ecosystem, we talked about all of the tools and guides and white papers and really supporting documentation that we have around controls version 8 and really around each version of controls. I should have mentioned that, that help the adopter. And I really am excited about the community defense model because over the years, We've brought more data, rigor, and transparency to the process of best practice recommendations. We stand firm on that. And as a result, we have released the Community Defense Model, or CDM, which is our most data-driven approach so far. So what CDM is it looks at the conclusions from a variety of threat intel to identify the top 5 attacks, as you've heard me reference several times today. And the approach here, without going into the extremely tedious detail, the approach here is utilizing the MITRE attack framework to create attack patterns, or essentially specific combinations of tactics and techniques used, which allow us to analyze the value of individual defense actions. So that is a lot. I know I give this speech occasionally. So what does that mean? So it answers this question. If I implement these safeguards, how protected am I from the most common attack types? So what CDM does is it provides data backing the declaration that safeguards implemented within implementation group 1 alone can effectively defend against 74% of the attack techniques found in the MITRE attack framework, which is a super powerful statement, right? Especially for smaller companies that don't have the advanced IT and cyber staff like larger and more mature organizations. So also since Kane has already said, most of you should be IG2. So if you're wondering where you sit in this with IG2 and IG3, once all of those safeguards are implemented, you're looking at percentages in the 90s. So really stand on this data-driven kill chain mapping to our defenses, which I think is super cool. Again, 2.0 was already released. It is available for download. Future state with that, CDM 2.1, all of the analyses is complete for that release. It's also slated for early Q1 of 2024. We're working on the back end just to make sure that we get the marketing and the blog posts right, but the data is already there. So 2.1 takes it a step further with all of the information from 2.0 to prove that also utilizing our secured configurations, which are the CIS benchmarks we discussed earlier, is an added tactical layer of defense for your systems. So in the report, we utilized a widely adopted and very extensive benchmark that I can tell you before it's released. It's Win 10. So it's the Windows 10 benchmark, which has a whole lot of recommendations behind it. So it's one of the biggest and most robust. So I think this is the last of the slides. So thank you so much for listening to me talk so much today. Hopefully all your questions are for Kane, since you had to hear my voice for the majority of the hour. So I'll send it back to you, Kane. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Charity. And I do love that CDM is mapped into MITRE. I think that for a lot of folks, that will help draw that association between, well, if we do this, here's the business value and here's the technical value, especially if you've been mapping your attack techniques that you're seeing live and in the field. The last thing that I want to bring up before we go to questions is that Hyperproof and the Center for Internet Security have worked on a new ebook called Unlocking the Power of the CIS Critical Security Controls. And everyone will be receiving a free copy after this webinar ends. You'll receive it by email, but if you're in a hurry, you can download it now from the side panel of this webinar. And this ebook covers everything we explored in today's session and quite a lot more, including more details about the top 18 top-level controls, common challenges to avoid during implementation, the key principles and guidelines of the CIS critical security controls, and quite a lot more. So with that, I want us to get into some questions. I want to thank the audience for spending part of your day with us. And if you have questions, please do drop that in the Q&A box on the side. And I see a question there from George. And George, I think this one's probably best addressed by Charity. And the question is CDM 2.0 only focused on implementation group 1? That's IG1.
So that is, yes, that is the scope. Now we do some mapping to show those numbers, right? I pulled the numbers directly from 2.0 to give you those percentages on where you would fall within the implementation groups as far as defense. But the scope of the paper is IG1, because that is the CIS messaging, right? Is to establish essential cyber hygiene. But the mapping is inclusive across the IGs.
Fantastic. I'm just marking that question as answered. And we have another question here. And the question is, I guess Charity and I both could answer this one. Can we explain how CIS CSC, starting from IG1, is a phased approach to achieving compliance goals? Charity, seeing how you took that last one, do you want me to go first on this one? And then
Yeah, go right ahead, Kane.
Okay, fantastic. So I'd say that if you start from IG1, if you have a series of compliance goals that your company is trying to meet, maybe you have to meet PCI or HIPAA or what have you, GDPR, name a compliance framework du jour. I think that the critical security controls map directly and occasionally indirectly, but mostly directly to those. And as you increase your maturity by moving from IG1 through IG2, and then as appropriate through IG3, you can really incrementally improve your cybersecurity maturity. I wouldn't say that any, and Charity can tell me if I'm wrong here, but I think that all of the IGs build on one another. So there's not going to be something in IG1 like, hey, y'all should be doing advanced threat learning using threat detection and threat hunting using machine learning and artificial intelligence in IG1. That probably is way up there in IG3. Whereas basic security controls that would map a compliance goal, maybe you should encrypt sensitive data, maybe you should encrypt your network traffic, those would be an IG1 style control. And as your company matures and has to meet additional compliance regimes, you would move into the later levels of IGs. Is that fair, Charity?
It absolutely is, and I'm so glad that we had this question from the audience, because this is the slide that I skimmed over, which Kane did amazing and said everything that I was going to say in his presentation, as well as in the answering the question. So yes, I fully endorse everything that you just said. Key takeaway there is really that the IGs do build upon each other, and just from a GRC perspective, like I've mentioned several times, like I spent the majority of my career before coming on board to CIS in the GRC space, and I've been there with it. You know, once the compliance goals, Kane, as you said, were established, or even a security posture or a maturity, if you're looking at maturity models and you want to go from a 2 to a 3, once you have that goal, the IG ones certainly build on each other, but also I'm a big advocate personally and professionally for self-assessment, and I know that you covered that a good bit in your presentation, Kane, as well. But self-assessment and really getting that gap analyses on not only on where you are currently, but being able to show regulators or executive management team that have an interest in it, your self-identified risk, like, yes, this is where we are. We understand that these are some of the pitfalls or the remediations that we need to put into place, but those self-identified risks and remediation also plan for continuous improvement. So you're continuously showing where you're going, and as far as a measurement of where you came from, even 6 months or a year ago. So I think it's a very valuable tool.
Fantastic. So there's another question in the Q&A, and I want to thank the audience for sending these in. And the question is, how can we determine which specific critical security controls are most relevant to our organization's unique security needs? I'm going to weigh in on this one first, Charity, and then you can possibly have a go. I'm going to say if you've got a computer in your organization, you should probably do an IG1. If you have computers, maybe if you're doing stuff on paper and pen, and I'm not quite sure how anybody would have made it to the webinar today if they're in that audience. So basically you should have IG1. And then I think that IG2, to get there, even though I think most enterprises need to be there, I think they have to tailor those controls, because IG2 and IG1 give control requirements. They explain, here's what you need to do. They don't tell you specifically how you have to implement a given control, but they do tell you here is a requirement, like you have to change people's passwords, you should have multi-factor authentication. They don't say, and you have to go buy this multi-factor authentication password manager thingamajig, right? That's where an organization has to really tailor those. And I think the way to further tailor that, and this is a bit of advanced thinking, is that if your organization has threat intelligence, and I mean that just not data, but if you actually have intelligence, like a proof that your organization is seeing engagement of a certain type that maps probably to the MITRE attack model, I'd say that's where you could probably further tailor that are based on your security needs to your organization, based on what you're seeing. And I hope if you're doing that, that you're tracking those as risks and that you're using a tool like Hyperproof to identify, here's what controls we currently have, here's what risks they're mitigating, here are the new emerging risks that we're seeing to our business based on the threat engagement. And so if we adopt these additional IG or additional specific safeguards or controls, that would improve your cybersecurity maturity. Charity, anything else there?
Not too much, Kane. I completely agree. As a former practitioner myself, completely agree with what you're saying there. Especially that it's starting with essential cyber hygiene and then going that route is where CIS lands on it. Also, we. The CIS controls team are responsible for writing the best practice. We don't necessarily tailor it to individual needs. Now, as a practitioner, do I understand that that's absolutely required? Sometimes, absolutely. But yeah, starting with that essential cyber hygiene and building from there is where we would recommend it.
Fantastic. There's one last question. I'm going to take it really quickly, and it's about strategies and recommendations that can be presented to the executive board to address concerns related to integrating those controls to your existing infrastructure. And I just want to take this one really quick. Map your risks to your controls, map your controls to your risks, show your company, show your board. Here's the business risks that we currently face. Here's how effectively we are reducing them. And then you can have a conversation about what additional controls you should have. Nobody would ever pick controls because they look like they're fun or because Charity and Kane said you should do so. Instead, understand what risks your company is currently facing and how well you're currently addressing them. Understand your current risk tolerance to each one of those risks from your board or from your executive management team. And that's where you can really drive a conversation around, here's where you need to lean in on additional control tailoring and additional control adoption. But with that, I think we've hit the top of the hour. I want to thank the audience for all of your questions today, and I want to thank Charities. It's been so much fun talking with you today. Lori, can you help close us out, please?
Absolutely. Thank you both so much. As stated a couple times throughout the presentation, the recording of this presentation will be available on our Bright Talk immediately following the end of the presentation. And then also we will be sending an email with not only a link to the recording, but also a link to the ebook that we've produced as well. So be on the lookout for that. And thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Kane. Thanks, team.